Anyway.
Hello, this is Todd Lewis, the host of the Praise of Folly podcast. Today, this is our Columbus Day podcast. I'm again joined by Fritz Imperial, and we're here to discuss the European colonization and what we've seen since probably the late 80s, early 90s, is a rise of Marxist historical revisionism based on the European contact with the indigenous peoples of the Americas. And they've tried to rename it like Indigenous Peoples Day or some such nonsense. And the narrative goes something like this. Prior to the Europeans, the native peoples were these peaceful savage, the noble savages living in harmony with nature and each other. You forget about Aztec human sacrifice for a moment. And the Europeans come in like genocidal proto-Nazis and wage a war of ceaseless extermination against the indigenous population. And they sort of had an ineffectual, people's war, Marxist style, against the Europeans with, a unified front. There were like no natives that sold out to the Europeans, except that there were, but we don't talk about them. And, it's just this one long story of dispossession of an innocent and, noble population by brutish and crude Europeans. And that's sort of the narrative. And, top to bottom, it's complete garbage. But, I think, Fritz, you're still in school, so
I've graduated. I graduated in May.
You graduated, okay. What experience of that narrative did you have in school?
Well, I didn't really have much of one. I never went. I went to a semi-Catholic small private school in a relatively conservative region. So there was certainly a lot of liberal crap, but it wasn't like Duke University bad. It wasn't like any of the universities we hear about. I never really ran into much about the narrative and stuff like that. But I mean, if you're talking about the history classes, I mean, everyone's kind of required to take a few, because I was a history major, so you're required to take a couple history classes, like certain types. And, I took American history, which was early, and, the first semester was like American history from like discovery of America to the Civil War, and then the other one, the second half, was Civil War to today. And the one before the first one, Discovery of America, the professor really he clearly had absolutely no political bias whatsoever, and that he really talked more about it from a European perspective, instead of like saying something like how, first you have America before the Europeans came was this place of wonder and joy and harmony, and then the evil Europeans came. He talked more about it, more what it is, because we are the descendants of Europeans and Africans, mainly in America. And so it talks about the reasons why the first settlers came over. So I never really got that narrative. And I said right before the stream that one of my professors, a different professor, last year, when people kept talking about Indigenous Peoples Day, he posted on Facebook a picture of human sacrifices by the Aztecs going, "Happy Indigenous Peoples Day." So I haven't really experienced the narrative myself in my own school, but I've definitely encountered it elsewhere, especially when I looked on Twitter today.
Yeah, there's another aspect to the narrative that is not it's not necessarily pro-native directly, but more indirectly. Like, for instance, they'll say, well, Columbus didn't discover America. It was the Vikings who went to Vinland. Or they'll say Columbus only landed in Haiti. It was actually John Cabot Lodge who discovered America. I mean, that's kind of quibbling. Yes, Columbus was a shameless...
I really don't have a problem with that. Like, I like the idea of Leif Erikson Day, because, it's a fun idea that, and it's actually, and it is historically accurate that it was the Vikings that were the first Europeans to America. But obviously, the point is Columbus was the one that actually mattered. That the Vikings disappeared from North America shortly after they arrived, and nobody really knew about North America until Columbus got there. And he's the reason why, it's because of him that all the colonization started.
Well, exactly. That's why Columbus is important. And while it's technically true the Vikings were there first, it's historically irrelevant because nothing really changed afterwards.
That would have been such an interesting, historical event if, say, like a small settlements of the Vikings actually survived, and when the first year and kind of became forgotten about, and then when the first European pilgrims came over, they're searching for like native for some native village, or they're looking around the woods or something, and they end up seeing like some blonde-haired, blue-eyed white people.
Yeah, that would be strange. Another separate myth it's an older myth, but is also equally pernicious about Columbus Day, is the sort of atheist myth that says that the medieval Christendom believed the world was flat, and these stupid superstitious Christians believed the world was flat, and then Columbus, crew thought they'd sail off the edge of the world, and this brave, plucky explorer scientist Columbus decided to chart out, kind of like Captain Kirk, go where no one's gone before, and he found North America. Well, that's not true at all. The flat Earth myth has long been since debunked. But
if anything, today there's probably more flat earthers if you can just check YouTube than there were in history in the past.
That's probably true.
Yes.
But that myth isn't as powerful as it used to be. It used to be much more powerful in the past, the flat Earth Columbus myth. But now that's when Columbus was kind of a hero. Now Columbus is kind of a villain representing all that's wrong with
it's essentially the thing the left loves to do, which is with history, is they take certain figures and when the narrative is convenient for them, they make them into heroes, and when it's not, they turn them into villains. So it's like they'll on one hand, when they want to defend separation of church and state, they'll uphold people like Thomas Jefferson, and then when they want to be anti-white, they'll say he was an evil racist slaveholder.
Yeah, exactly. It's very they just do whatever convenient for them at the time.
Yes. And the thing is, it's a misrepresentation of history, because the thing is, history is never black and white. History is hardly ever, even like among one of the most kind of asserted ideas of history being good versus evil, i.e. World War II. The thing is, the Nazis were doing absolutely horrible, disgusting things, but the problem is the Allies, particularly the Soviets, were doing just as horrible stuff.
I think the only time history is black and white is Pilate and Jesus.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, if we're talking about like personal instances, certainly, there have been times when you had genuinely good people, like the saints and such. But, if we're going to talk about, in wars, there's never really a good guy in it.
Yeah, didn't Benjamin Franklin say there was no such thing as a bad peace or a good war?
Yeah, essentially, in war, the good guy is the guy who wins.
Yep.
But I guess back to Columbus Day, I think part of the narrative, like, I guess if we can start cracking into the narrative that the left or the revisionists have set up, it's that, first off, as evident by the kind of demographics today, the way there was no monolith. We keep thinking of the Europeans as being this monolith that attacked the Native Americans, when first off, they were in constant conflict with each other via the Spanish, Portuguese, French, and English and Dutch. And the way that each of them treated the natives was very, very different, because with the Spanish and the Spanish Empire in Latin America, they more or less have integrated and intermixed with the natives, which some of them they enslaved and some of them they just kind of left alone. I mean, you have this early kind of papal statement, declaring that enslavement of the Native Americans was against God's will. And then meanwhile, with the British and later Americans had the resettlement policies of either exterminate the natives or displace them. And so the thing is, there was not one unified European response. That's why today Hispanics, Latinos, are largely a mixture of native and Spanish descent. So if they're going to be if the progressives or the left are going to be against, descendants of the explorers of the Europeans, that's most Latinos.
Well, and that's a good point. There's no monolithic European, and by the same token, there's no monolithic Native American. Classic example of this dynamic is Mexico at the time of the Spanish conquest. The reigning superpower was the Aztec Empire under Moctezuma II, and within the Aztec Empire were subjugated tribes who were farmed periodically for sacrificial victims. Mm-hmm. And what happened was the Tlaxcala, the most powerful confederation of tribes under the Aztec yoke, saw Cortez as a liberator.
Yeah.
And they initially attacked Cortez, but when they saw his advanced firepower, his weaponry, his guns, his swords, his horses, they're like, hey, this guy can help us out to defeat the hated Aztecs. And in fact, other Indian tribes, but the most famous, of course, being the Tlaxcala, allied with the Spanish. And during the first century of Spanish occupation of Mexico, they were treated quite well. In fact, even the traditional land of the Aztec royal family wasn't taken away until at least 100 years later. So the traditional nobility maintained their land even after the Spanish conquest.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the thing is, if we're going to talk about how things are not a monolith, so and I think this is just an offhand kind of sort of criticism of the alt-right, saying that there's this monolithic white culture, when I think what more helps people against the idea of anti-white narratives is going, there isn't. Europeans are an incredibly diverse group of cultures and peoples. I mean, you have, Portuguese and Russians, Irish people and Greeks. They're not the same. And the thing is, going back to the Native Americans is, again, the Aztecs were doing things that were absolutely horrible. I mean, they were effectively no better than the Spanish. The only difference is the Spanish, I guess in terms of numbers, probably killed more people indirectly anyways.
Well, indirectly through diseases, but they didn't really know about that very much. Well, in fact, what was the real cause here was when they invited Cortez into the capital of Tenochtitlan, I think presumably as a preparation for human sacrifice, they brought basically these disease carriers right into the heart of their empire, and neither side knew it at the time when Cortez made his breakout on the La Noche Trista, the night of tears, I think it means. They'd already infected them with all these diseases, and they didn't even know about it until,
here's the thing. If they're going to argue that because of disease, that this was some sort of implicit or explicit, kind of desire by the Europeans to kill off the natives, then essentially you could make the same argument that, hey, you can blame the Chinese for the Black Plague.
Well, exactly. Yeah, exactly, because, or the Mongols, because they were the ones that used the infected carcasses.
Or the Arabs, because it went along the Silk Road to the Middle East, and that got transferred to the Mediterranean.
Yeah, the important thing is this: there's no monolithic white or red nation.
Yes.
If you go to Mexico prior to Columbus, they don't see themselves as Mexicans. They see themselves as, this is my tribe, and that's your tribe, and we're mortal enemies. And it's in part why the Europeans were so successful. They used the process of divide and conquer. In the North American context, the Sioux Indian tribe, which had migrated from Canada in the 17th and 18th centuries, had displaced the Kiowa, the Cheyenne, the Shoshone, and the Kiowa tribes from their ancestral homelands.
In the area of upstate New York, where I live, that was part of the giant Iroquois Confederacy, and they were mortal enemies with the Algonquins. And so during the kind of the French and Indian, and then American Revolutionary War, you had those two tribes kind of flipping sides between the British and the French or the Americans just to spite each other.
Well, exactly. I mean, the U.S. cavalry hired Pawnee scouts in the Sioux War against Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, and so what needs to be understood is when the Europeans came on the scene with their advanced technology of gunpowder, metallurgy, and horseback riding.
Yeah, horses. Well, the thing is, even before the Comanche riders, are the kind of noble kind of Iroquois, the Native American cavalry. The thing is, horses were not one of the reasons why the New World was nowhere near as developed as the Old World. It's because there was not horses there. You didn't have horses in North America. You didn't have cows. You didn't have farm animals. You didn't have work animals that could both be used to improve farming or act as food. So you're going to get much smaller populations and far less development.
Exactly. So something Joseph Smith failed to recognize when he wrote the Book of Mormon, but
we won't tell Ben.
We won't tell Ben. But the point is this: that it was in the rational self-interest of Native American tribes to ally with Europeans, because if they were in the weaker if they were the weaker side in a power struggle, they would see the Europeans as a mechanism to reverse their misfortune. And the Tlaxcala are probably the best example of this. And in fact, after the conquest, the Tlaxcala would write essentially letters and to the King of Spain saying that we made a deal with you for these rights and privileges, and we're not getting those from the conquistadors. And so they actually had some legal recourse to the Spanish king himself. In fact, Stanley G. Payne, one of the leading scholars on Spain, demonstrates that due to the papal influence you mentioned earlier, Fritz, that the Spanish monarchy intentionally preserved the indigenous populations of Mexico and Peru. They said, look, these people will have some rights within the Spanish kingdom, the right of appeal to the monarchy. And that's why they're still around today, because they were not exterminated. They were given some rights.
And the fact is, they were largely kept, as, I think there was definitely slavery, even though there was an official papal bull in the early 1500s saying that, going against, saying that any enslavement of the native peoples is an act against God. The fact is, though, modern Hispanics are a mixture of Europeans and natives. It's not like in America where you have a very clear distinction between white people and natives. And the thing I've always found funny is like when people, black or white, in America will kind of tout that, hey, I'm 1/16th Cherokee or something, because like it just sounds so ridiculous, because it's like we think it's magic or something to have native blood in us, and the thing is, like, it's just so ridiculous. I mean, Native Americans were not magic, okay? They were just a people like anybody else.
Well, and not only they're people like anybody else, they accomplished far less than most of their contemporaries in other parts of the world.
I mean, although, if we're going to go back to Central America, the cities that were created, considering the fact that they didn't have any written language, that they didn't have any access to other cultures of the world, that they managed to build the things like the Mayan pyramids, is immensely impressive.
Well, I think what we need to talk about is Mexico at the time of the European, and even to some extent the Caribbean at the time of the European conquest. So, for instance, in the Caribbean,
you had incredibly savage tribes.
Oh yeah, well, first of all, you had extreme diversity. You had the Taino tribe, which was very almost peaceful and almost suicidal in their ability, in non-resistance to the Spanish. But then you had the Carib tribe, which was vicious cannibals, from which you get the name Caribbean.
Yeah.
And so there's not one Native American tribe here, and some of them were quite vicious. The Aztecs were, or as they were called, the Mexica, sometime in the 13th and 14th centuries, invaded Mexico and conquered the city-states that were there at the time, and set up a vicious regime of human sacrifice and cannibalism.
I mean, even if you think about it, like the Aztec Empire, much of these people were tribes. The fact is, just the fact that, you had an Aztec Empire, but the Aztec Empire was far younger. The Aztec Empire was established after most of the major universities in Europe were established. The Aztec Empire is centuries younger than even a lot of the accomplishments of the Europeans during the medieval period.
Oh yeah. I mean, it's like the 14th
century
and 14th century, or no, 15th century when they actually got started. So they're newcomers to the scene. But on average, 20,000 people were sacrificed every year, and on average. Now, in the dedication of the great temple in Tenochtitlan to the war god Huitzilopochtli, they sacrificed something like 80,000 individuals over a period of a week. And without getting into too much detail, I mean, they would literally have a stone knife. I think it was made of obsidian volcanic stone. And they literally cut the heart out of your beating chest and then kick your body down the temple steps, where the celebrants would then carve you up and have you for dinner.
No, they were these peaceful hippie natives.
Oh, yeah, exactly. I mean, it's the idea. You could go to the marketplace, and they would have slabs of human meat for sale, like you'd find steak or pork.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's no wonder. I mean, no wonder the Spanish were outraged at such behavior. I mean, today I think Hillary Clinton would probably advocate for humanitarian intervention in a place like that.
Well, yeah, it depends on. Well, hey, we're allied with Saudi Arabia, so.
Yeah, you see, but the Aztecs don't have oil, though.
Yeah, the Aztecs don't have oil. It's a problem. Oh, no, I don't know. Is there oil in the Yucatan?
I don't know. Maybe.
There could be. Anyway, I think this is getting off topic, but I mean, the point is, much of the Native Americans, especially people like the Aztecs, who were some of the first people to be in contact with the Spanish, were vicious, horrible people.
Yeah. The Maya, another example. Now, the Maya actually outlasted the Aztecs. Their sort of decentralized political system allowed them to resist longer. But really, Aztec civilization went through three phases. There was the Classical Age, which was probably from around the 1st century AD to like 900 AD, where they had the great flourishing of arts and sciences. And even then, they practiced human sacrifice, and that's what's called flower wars. You fight wars to capture victims, to sacrifice to the gods. But what happened was, after the Classical Golden Age, they then fought to conquer an empire. So this is not just for human sacrifice, but they fight to kill people, to conquer city-states. And ultimately, the Maya civilization destroyed itself because in their lust for power, they fought wars of extermination. See, in the Yucatan, water is hard to come by, drinkable water. There's underground aquifers that supply these city-states in the jungle with water, since they didn't lack access to lakes and streams in most cases. And what they would do is they'd take a city and they'd dump dead bodies and feces into it to poison the water supply to kill off the city. And they did it to enough cities where they weren't able to maintain the population anymore because they'd poisoned their own water supply. And this was long before the Spanish even showed up. By the time the Spanish do show up in the northern Yucatan, closer to Cuba, you have a few city-states that survived on as a shadow of their former glory. I mean, the kind of vicious cycle of warfare we saw in the ancient Near East or medieval Europe was repeated on a grand scale in the New World as well.
Sorry, yeah. Even without the Europeans intervening. Sorry, I was muted for a sec. But yeah, the fact is, you could almost say then the Europeans helped stop this cycle and start organizing these people.
Well, yeah, sure. I mean, what we had was a population of people that worshipped demons. And as we saw in ancient Canaan, these demons demanded human sacrifice. Yeah. I mean, one of the key signs of a demonic religion is sacrificing human beings.
That's why how we get the idea that Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton is basically the demons Mammon versus Moloch, because Moloch is the god of child sacrifice.
Well, exactly.
And also, and that was even used by the Romans to as a slander against the Carthaginians, and like it's even debatable whether or not the Carthaginians actually, in their worship of I don't even think they worship other people like Tanit and the other.
Well, they were. I'm sure they worshipped other gods, but being Phoenicians, wasn't Baal the god they had to sacrifice?
I guess so. So they did human sacrifice, but yes, and the Romans use that against them. And so when the Spanish do it, it's called Imperial. Yeah, but of course
the Romans had gladiators, so it's not really much different.
Well, that's almost worse because it's like the whole point of it is entertainment. Although the thing is, with gladiator fights, gladiators are freaking expensive as hell, so you really don't want them to die.
Well, not the good ones, anyhow.
Yeah, you want them more. You want it to be more or less a spectacle of like they'll kill a slave or something like that,
or a wild animal.
Yeah.
Well, the other thing about the Spanish that has to be kept in mind is during the Renaissance and Reformation period, the French, the British, and the Dutch created what's called the Black Legends, which revolved around the Inquisition in the New World in order to discredit the Spanish. And so a lot of this is also colored by a kind of propaganda bias from Spain's other European competitors, which again, as you point out, demonstrates that Europeans are not monolithic.
Yeah. And of course, Columbus himself wasn't even Spanish. He was Italian.
He was Genoese.
Yeah, he was Italian.
Yeah, Genoese. I know. It's
but yes, I mean, I guess going back to the narrative, how do you think this narrative actually got started? What do you think the ultimate goal of being against Columbus Day is? Because I think you said before the stream started that it's not just about they're not really necessarily against Columbus himself, but it's a useful vessel for them to attack something else, right?
Yeah, I think fundamentally the target audience, is Western civilization, but more specifically Christianity. Mm-hmm. But though Western civilization is also indicted as well by this.
Well, white people.
And what it is, it's an attempt to politically disenfranchise white people. It's one more element of the narrative to disenfranchise white people.
Mhm.
And the other thing that we see is also that the left is a disparate alliance of different groups, and so like, for instance, like La Raza and the people that want to create Aztlan, they can use it as an excuse to justify their invasion of the Southwest, California, New Mexico,
I mean, and the thing is,
Texas.
again, that goes back to my point, is that the problem, the problem with that narrative is that these, they're trying to claim that they are natives, that they're basically native Mexicans, quote unquote, that are trying to retake the area that we won from them in the Mexican War. The first problem with that is, again, most Latinos are a mixture of Europeans and natives. The second problem with that is, first off, the Mexican War, we won fair and square. It was just a good old-fashioned, relatively short war. We took the territory. We won.
We even paid them for it.
Yeah, well, that was the Gadsden Purchase, but
no, even before that, we actually paid for.
And the thing is, it's part of like the Marines' hymn is from the halls of Montezuma, because the Montezuma's capital, Tenochtitlan, is where modern Mexico City is, and U.S. troops had, by the end of the war, were occupying that, and there was talk in Congress of annexing Mexico outright. But obviously, because it would have been such a problem of trying to incorporate huge numbers of new states and a very different culture, they decided against it. And the last problem is that the areas occupied by Mexico, like in 1846, the areas that was part of the Mexican Empire at the time, or of Mexico, California, Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, and the thing is, those aside from small Native and Mormon tribes, you had small communities of white settlers and prospectors, Texans, some slaves. It was not a very heavily populated area, No.
Another reason I think why this narrative is pushed. Aristotle, when he discusses in his Politics the nature of tyranny, he argues that tyrants are afraid of free men that can organize and resist the oppression of tyrants. And he gives a list of rules that a tyrant can follow to essentially emasculate the men under his control, to disincentivize them from leading a rebellion. And part of this is by creating this narrative attacking white people, white men. They're effectively, castrating or emasculating the men of the United States, so that they feel guilty, so that they'll accept this inferior status that they wouldn't otherwise accept.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a general. Tyrants have done this for down the ages. In fact, Aristotle said that a tyrant will empower slaves and women because they can hold it over their masters and husbands, and generally have a good time, as he says. And yet, very seldom will a man hit his own woman. I mean, some men do, and they usually get, thrown in prison as criminals and assaultants. But most men are not going to just hit their woman. And if their woman's acting up, they're just kind of deal with it.
Yeah, and the thing is,
and that's what they do.
It kind of and the thing is, it kind of goes with the kind of nature of the sexes, that men and women clearly think differently. Women are more nurturing, men are more leaders, and so women are. There's a reason why women tend to be, #not all, tend to be more for large scale immigration, because it's because of the narrative that we have to take care of these people, And the thing is, obviously that's good to, that's an excellent trait to have when you're a mother taking care of your children, but it's very poor when you're talking about actual kind of policy,
Yeah,
you kind of see widespread. Women tend to vote more left wing.
Oh yeah, I mean, Ann Coulter a few years ago said that if women never got the right to vote, we would have had Republican presidents since Woodrow Wilson or something.
Yeah, I mean, you can almost see this explicitly with somebody like Angela Merkel.
Yeah. Well, wasn't there that one map called "If Women Didn't Vote," and it showed you how many states would be like Republican states?
Yeah.
And it's like 45 of the 50 states would be Republican.
Yeah, it's a demographic, but the thing is, I mean, again, it's this indictment of white people as being these horrible conquerors, whilst people like La Raza are trying to tout themselves as conquerors. So it's completely hypocritical as well.
Well, it is hypocritical. Well, let's talk about what the Europeans did. So people think, okay, throughout human history, whether it's been Native Americans or Chinese or Egyptians or Romans, you've had conquest and imperialism. It's what humans do.
Yeah.
But what made European Christendom different, is that while yes, it did indulge in these same vicious activities, they had checks and balances. Let me give you a classic example with the Spanish conquest of Mexico. When the Jesuits came in, they wrote there was the Bernal Diaz narrative, which was the narrative from the Spanish Cortez perspective, but there was also a narrative of the son of Moctezuma II, who was written down by a Jesuit to give the Aztec side of the narrative. Furthermore, we also have an account where I think it was Cortez was leading a Spanish expedition to the Yucatan, and he had as his captive the Moctezuma's son, Cuauhtemoc. And then there was the city-state, this Mayan city-state. And Cuauhtemoc was killed under the pretense that he was conspiring against the Spanish. So the Aztec narrative says that no, Cuauhtemoc was innocent. The Spanish narrative says that Cuauhtemoc was an evil schemer. But the interesting thing here is the Maya narrative, which is also preserved, Spanish, that Cuauhtemoc was conspiring against Cortez. But here's the thing. The Aztecs did not record the narrative of their conquered peoples. The Romans
did they even know? I don't think they had a written language, so...
They might not have, but even like in oral traditions, they didn't do it. The Romans, the Chinese, the Egyptians, they didn't record the defeated people's narratives. Only in Christendom do we have people say, hey, you know what? They are human beings like us.
Yes.
They might have been on the wrong side of a war. I mean, you're not going to have the Aztecs or the Romans or the Egyptians going to a defeated tribe, interviewing their defeated king, and having them write down the narrative of their people.
Yeah, and the thing
that's not going to happen.
Yeah, the thing is, Christianity has done so much to kind of there's a quote by Heinrich Heine, the German poet from the 19th century that Krautenty uses as a picture, is that he said basically the thing that's holding back what he kind of described as this kind of Teutonic fury of the Germans. The only thing that's kind of holding back that type of viciousness that existed before they adopted Christianity is Christianity, essentially. And I think that's more applicable to Europe in general, or to humanity in general, in that when you have a Christian people, yes, they'll indulge in horrible, vicious acts, but there's definitely a restraint that's exercised. Christianity acts as a massive restraint on cruelty.
Well, yes, and to be fair, the ancient Celts and Germans and Vikings also practiced human sacrifice. Yeah, and it was only the advent of Christianity that stopped it.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, if you were to go to the ancient Celts or the ancient Vikings or Germans, say around the year, the 1st century AD, and then you'd go to the Maya. Yeah, they're both having human sacrifice. They're both pretty wicked, barbarous people. Mm-hmm. But the Celts and the Germans,
even the Romans, again, with gladiator fights, they did that. Was humans? People did have a lust for, murdering people.
Blood.
And the thing is, I guess, if we're going to even talk about slavery, the thing is, first off, in the Middle Ages, slavery didn't really happen. Slavery was not widespread in any form in medieval Europe. Obviously, the biggest reason for that, it's not, to be fair, it's not necessarily a moral reason, but even though you had plenty of medieval scholars denouncing slavery as going against God's will, it was more because the economics of the time during the feudal period. First off, because of the feudal system, you don't need slaves to work the land. You have peasants work the land because which serfdom is not slavery. The peasants are human beings. They're not the property of their masters. They work the land in exchange for being able to live under the Lord's protection. So first off, all the mass unemployment that happened in ancient Rome went away. Everyone has a job now. And secondly, because there wasn't really because more or less the main currency of the feudal ages was titles. Money wasn't really that much circulated anymore. People, the rich, quote unquote, didn't have the money to afford slaves. But what I'm getting at is that essentially, even if you have slavery, what Christianity does, it asserts that these slaves are still human beings. Even if you have sexism, you still have the Christian narrative, which is women are human beings. That under Christian teachings, especially by people like St. Paul, it's that there is a universal equality of human beings under God. And you don't really find that in other religions or before Christianity.
Well, back to Mexico and the Spanish,
Mhm.
a good example of this is the women. I mean, the Christian civilization that Spain brought with it was a quantum leap for women in Mexico. I mean, you have to understand, in pagan society, women are chattel. They're essentially almost sex slaves for the delight of the powerful war chiefs.
Mhm.
And the Spanish said no. And not only that, they actually educated women in Spanish America. A woman could go to a church university, a Jesuit university, and get an education. Something inconceivable in the Aztec or Mayan empires.
Exactly. I mean, what Christianity does is people talk about St. Paul as a sexist, and when he says women should be allowed to talk in the church, the whole thing he's saying is that there's still inequality, and he says men have an obligation to love their wives, and even the institution of marriage that's set up in Christianity it's especially liberating for women, because the fact is it asserts that adultery is wrong for both partners, and that the only kind of acceptable marriage is a man and a woman being faithful to each other. And so so polygamy is out, homosexuality is out. You basically have a one man and one woman, and they're both devoted to one another. And so it creates this kind of equal dichotomy. It's creates a sort of equal establishment institution of marriage, which far from enslaving women to their husbands, it binds them both together to form a more perfect union.
Well, it's interesting also, homosexuality and polygamy both end up devaluing women, because in polygamy, women are just a commodity that can be bought and sold for whatever reason. And in homosexuality, they're just not valued at all. I mean, if you read Plato's Symposium, it's very sexist. They all say, women, those creatures. But we all know that it's really men that you want to have intimate relationships with.
I mean, Alcibiades is supposedly trying to seduce Socrates, right?
Yeah, let's not go there now.
Yeah,
but what I'm saying is that, the Christian civilization that the Pilgrims and the conquistadors and the French trappers and the Dutch merchants brought with them, for all of its faults, was a massive improvement, not only for the natives themselves, because no longer could you be eaten. Let's give another example. In North America, the Iroquois were particularly vicious. They would practice ritual sacrifice as well, ritual torture. One of the things that would happen is when they capture enemy soldiers in battle, they would build these parapets over fire, and they'd have people walk over them to get burned. And they'd also stab them, and they have women and children. As they'd run through a gauntlet of women and children, they get stabbed by sharpened stakes, and they'd be stoned.
Mm-hmm.
And
there was a great movie back from, I think, the 80s or 90s called Black Robe, and it depicts kind of like two French missionaries to I guess modern day French Canada, ministering to a Native American tribe, and it's a very good movie, and it depicts both kind of like the questioning of what they're doing here, but it also it shows it's much like, I guess, Apocalypto, where it shows the kind of native tribes in all their kind of raw savagery and beauty.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Apocalypto. It's a movie that I probably wouldn't watch again because it's so brutal.
Yeah,
but I tell you, Mel Gibson did not pull any punches. I mean, he didn't quite show the heart coming out of the chest, but it's bad enough. You don't have to see that.
But again, with what Black Robe does, it does show that it goes directly against the narrative that these were peaceful natives. That certainly they did have a lot of things that were kind of beautiful and admirable about them, but they were not these perfect people. They could be incredibly savage.
Oh yeah, there were some peaceful tribes like the Delaware and the Taino and the Cherokee.
Or even among people like the Iroquois, they did have a lot of culture, like with the longhouses and such, and obviously not all of them were acting vicious, but the fact is, it's all about, you have to take the rough with the smooth. They did good things and they did terrible things. They're essentially just like everybody else.
Well, exactly. The other thing is, though, there is one thing that is unique about the Native Americans of North and South America. It's just how unbelievably primitive they were. They didn't have metallurgy or the wheel.
Mhm.
I mean, even a wheelbarrow. You don't need a horse to invent a wheelbarrow.
Yeah. Again, it's because of the. I think it's because of the fact that you didn't have cultural diffusion with the old world. Like Western Europe, medieval Europe was already relatively, was already had cities, and it was a civilized area for the time. But you still had them getting improvements because of cultural diffusion with a place like China or the Middle East. You didn't have any, so you'd have there was contact between the civilized centers of the world, from cities in Europe and then places in China and then the Middle East. You didn't have that in the New World. You had the center of you had the cities in Mexico, and you had a few areas in North America, but they didn't have any sort of cultural developments, or they didn't have any of these technological developments that were able to spread. Again, also helping them or aiding in the fact that they were so primitive is because they didn't have pack animals, and they didn't really have, as far as I know, they didn't have a written language.
So you're going all Jared Diamond on me now, huh?
Was he the guy who wrote Guns, Germs, and Steel?
Yeah. No,
I haven't read that, but
I'm familiar with the broad narrative. I think Diamond brings up some good points, but I think it's a bit reductionist because, for instance, in a place with the same region, like say East and West Germany or North and South Korea, the environment alone doesn't account for the differences between those cultures. The same people in the same country.
It's a little different. I mean, it is a little different because those are both modern instances, and it's based on the fact that you had very strict political structures governing the societies.
Well, we can look at Athens and Sparta. It's the same thing. Two Greek countries. Yeah. Sparta had no money. Sparta was very primitive compared to Athens.
The thing is, I found it interesting. It's the reasons why the Spartans went away is because their extremely harsh military culture creates some of these incredibly good warriors, but the problem is they were so selective. Their population ran out.
Well, exactly. I think another reason why the native peoples were so backward, even not just compared to Europeans, but even like the ancient Near East and China. The Near East and China, is their commitment to devil worship. I mean, the idea of these devil gods that demanded human sacrifice. I don't think at any point in human history had human sacrifice reached such a peak as in Mexico.
You still have obviously the problem with it as well. The fact that the population was so relatively low is obviously as example by a place like China. The more people you have, the more ability you're going to have people that make advances in culture. If you don't even have any massive cities, you're not going to have culture.
It's human capital. What you need is human capital, and that's why hunter-gatherers and nomads are typically primitive, because they lack the human capital necessary to develop modern.
I mean, obviously the I guess exception is the Mongols, but
they only copy the Chinese technology, but yeah. But generally, the native peoples, and not only that, like I said earlier in this podcast, there were many native peoples that welcomed the Europeans and actively allied with them. The Iroquois allied with the British in both the French and Indian War and the American Revolution.
Yeah.
The Cherokee allied with the Confederacy during the American Civil War. The Tlaxcala allied with the Cortez and the Mexican invasion. And its funny thing is when Pizarro invaded the Peru, the Inca Empire, Atahualpa had just won a civil war by murdering his brother. I forget his name at the moment. And his brother's forces were still fighting. And he was the elder brother. And when Pizarro came into Peru, they saw him as a way to shift the balance of power in their favor. And the Spanish justified what they were doing by appealing to the right of primogeniture. They said the elder son should inherit the land. And so they actually fought with, you don't hear this in the narrative. Pizarro did not fight the Inca all by himself. He had help from the forces of Cuauhtémoc's brother.
Yeah.
So in fact, if Pizarro and Cortez had not had native allies,
they wouldn't have won.
They never have won.
You couldn't have 500 conquistadors, even with guns, even with metallurgy and horses. That's still not going to be, if you're fighting against tens of thousands of natives, that's not going to work. You have to actually ally with them, and that's how they won. They didn't do it just by going Europeans, quote unquote, conquered the natives. No, Europeans and their native allies conquered the natives.
Exactly, and the narrative consistently leaves that out for obvious reasons.
Yes.
Now, in North America, it was different. There was this, given that North America was sparsely populated north of the Rio Grande River, we didn't need there were native allies, to be sure, but they were not quite as important. They were more useful for scouting and woodcraft as far rather than cannon fodder as in the Spanish conquest.
Yeah, again, the same thing. That the policy of the British and then Americans towards the natives was different from the Spanish. Again, was a policy of intermixing and kind of just governing over the native territories, whereas the British and Americans did more exterminate and displace the populations.
I would say the French were like the Spanish as well.
Yeah. The French. The French relationship, because again, French colonies were also relatively not. The French didn't really have all that large numbers of settlers like the British did, because you had a few French cities in the French Empire in North America. You had Montreal, Quebec, and then New Orleans.
Exactly. Well, I would say the British were probably better with Indian relations, because during the 19th century, Canada had a very different westward expansion than the United States. It was much more peaceful, and it was much more conciliatory to the native tribes than in the lower 48.
Yeah.
So I think one of the reasons why in the United States there was so much conflict between, say, the Native Americans and the U.S. Colonists is for the French, and because they were there kind of just to get fur from trappers, and because the Spanish wanted to intermix, the United States really wanted to have a new country run by white Anglo-Saxon Protestants.
Yes.
Which is not what the Spanish or the French, or even to some extent the British and Canada wanted to do. And it led of necessity to a more direct and brutal conflict, which lasted for 300 years until Plymouth and actually Jamestown in 1604 until 1890 with the battle of the massacre at Wounded Knee. Yeah. And but the other thing is you mentioned the Hispanics are part white. The Mexican Empire that we defeated in the Mexican War was run by white Creoles, native-born Spaniards. There weren't even any indigenous people in the government. They were native-born Spaniards. Yeah,
and again, it varies. Like right now, you can actually see a picture. I found this just on Wikipedia. Is that there's a picture of a Mexican school in Chihuahua, Mexico, and all the kids. There's 30 kids. They're all white. They're all blonde-haired and blue-eyed. 15% to 20% of the Mexican of Mexico is essentially completely white. And then, it varies in places like Brazil, about half the population is white. In Argentina, about 97% of the population is mostly European descent. But that's largely because Argentina was settled very different. It was settled a lot more like North America was, because the fact is Argentina is very sparsely populated, and it has a climate and geography much like the Great Plains. So during the 19th century, when you had all the Europeans coming over to America, about 27 million towards the end of the 19th century came to the U.S., and about 6 million went to Argentina, largely from Spain and Italy and other European countries.
Well, really, the only really populated centers were Mexico and Peru.
Yes.
Outside of that, they were pretty sparsely populated. I mean, in Mexico, you might have had 10 to 20 million people, because Tenochtitlan itself had a population of 1 million. Yeah. And if a capital city was that big, how big must the empire have been to support such a... The standing army of the Aztecs was about 1 million men. So maybe 20, 30 million people were living in Mexico at the time. And then Peru, maybe another 10 to 20 million people. But outside of that, like North America, the Brazilian basin with the Amazon River, and Argentina varies, or the waste of Canada, Very sparsely populated, and it can't be stressed enough. The overriding cause of Indian death was disease.
Yes.
90+% of all indigenous peoples that died due to disease. And the only instance of actual biological warfare that I can think of
was the blanket.
Pontiac's uprising. Yeah, the plague blanket in 1763, when the British tried to infect Pontiac's army. That's all I can think of any other intentional biological warfare.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is, so in your opinion, what do you how do you think the best way to go against the kind of, when you're on Twitter, when you're engaging with people IRL, is how do you think the best way to quickly flip this narrative over is?
Basically, you need something pithy. # leave your heart in Mexico.
Yeah, that's a good one.
That's actually from Bill Lind. I didn't come up with it myself,
okay.
but yeah.
I stand with Columbus.
Yeah, I stand with Columbus.
Or I'm a Colombian. Because the thing is,
if you say that, Fritz, they might think of that one first-person shooter game instead, though.
Oh, or the country, but Colombia. But again, the fact is, if they hate Columbus so much, why don't they ask them to change the name of Washington D.C., or why don't they ask them to change the name of the British province of British Columbia, or why don't they ask them to change the name of the country Colombia, because that's who it's named after.
I know. It's you know why? It's a narrative, and they want to disenfranchise white.
They have no interest in actual history. It's like the Confederate flag thing. It's like nobody was talking about the Confederate flag until some idiot had that flag with him. Yeah.
Well, again, it was they're just waiting. As Rahm Emanuel said, never let a crisis go to waste.
Yes.
They have an agenda, and what they want to do is every time they can do it, they exploit that agenda. Ruthlessly exploit any crisis to push that agenda.
And they're very good at it because they control the media and they control education. They're easily able to kind of translate it into stories and teaching.
Yeah. So we're about out of time. So do you have any final words before we close out?
Well, I would just say again, I think the conclusions you can take from this is that first off is that the Native Americans and the Europeans were not monoliths. There's a huge amounts of diversity in both the Europeans and the way they treated the indigenous peoples of the Americas and the indigenous peoples themselves. You had a ranging from horrible human sacrifice going on every day in large cities like in the Aztecs, and then these tiny little tribes that attacked each other occasionally, but lived in incredibly sparsely populated areas in North America. And lastly, I think just on the last note, just about slavery itself, it's actually quite admirable how quickly, relatively, the slave trade, the Columbian exchange, went down. From it started probably around the 1600s when you had the slave, the mass slave plantations started rising. And it was only with around 200 years when it went away with the end of the slave trade and the abolition of slavery. So relatively to history, that's not that long.
Not compared to the Roman or Islamic slave trade.
Yes.
But my final words, I think it's interesting that the greatest advocates of Indian rights today are descendants of the warlike tribes like the Iroquois and the Sioux. The last people that should be lecturing anybody about imperialism. And I guess leave your heart in Mexico on this Columbus Day.
Happy Columbus Day, everyone.
This is Todd Lewis for the Praise of Polly podcast, signing off.